today. So, we have been journeying our way through the story of Jonah. I don't know where my clicker's gone, so Rachel's going to have to do it. We've been journeying through the book of Jonah, and last week Ian spoke about Jonah chapter 1. If you're not familiar with Jonah, Jonah is not the guy to imitate when it comes to being a prophet. Interestingly, we learn in Jonah chapter 4 that he actually really knows the heart of God. He knows that God is merciful and compassionate. So he knows God, he just doesn't like the implications. He doesn't like the fact that God would dare love his enemies. And so he runs and he finds himself on a boat, a storm brews, and then everyone says, whose fault is this? Jonah's name gets up and he gets thrown out of the boat and he gets swallowed by a great fish. This is where we are entering the story today. And as is the case here at ASBC, when we do these interviews, it's actually less of an interview, and what we hope it is more of a theological reflection. We look at the text and we invite people to tell us what it is that they see, as well as how that relates to their area of vocational expertise. And in this case, as humble, I saw your eyes go up with expertise there, Tim. But Tim is a counsellor. He has done a lot of work with people going through significant trauma and deep emotions. And that's why I invited Tim to share today, because what we're going to see in the text is much of this. So tell us a little bit, just before we get going, Tim, about your story. Like, what brought you to faith, and what kind of, I suppose, informed that kind of trajectory of you heading into this vocational field?
Sure. How much time have we got?
Just a little bit. Enough time for me to find the clicker?
No, and it's not about me, of course, but to give some context, I guess 2008, I came up to Alice Springs as a new Christian. Feeling called, thinking Alice Springs was closer to Darwin than it was Central Australia. Maybe many of us, all closer to Uluru. So I had a real heart for God. I was working at Red Cross at the time. I was a bit burnt out, I think. And I think I was burnt out because I was relying on my own strength. And I guess that's important for this, what we're talking about here in Jonah, in a way. And from that, I guess, leant hard into God, on fire for God, and then went back, trained up in a certain discipline, and then came back up 7 years ago. So
it's fantastic. Well, we're going to probably hear a little bit more of your story and experience and the kind of things that you see, maybe even each and every day to some extent, in and through this story. I'm going to dive into the text just so everyone knows where we're at. And as we do this, I invite you to consider, what's God saying? Because that's the same questions I'm going to be asking, basically, Tim, here. It continues, from inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, in my distress I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. The engulfing waves threatened me or were at my throat. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. To the earth beneath barred me in. The earth beneath barred me in forever. So some quite emotive prayer and poetry in there, Tim. Particularly as people who are called as followers of Jesus to engage with people in their points of pain, frustration. What do you hear? What do you hear here in Jonah, in his prayer? What kind of deep emotions, maybe, do you hear?
It's interesting, back on that expert, I guess what I've learned over the time is never to assume that I know someone's individual experience. So, hey, this is just based on the imagery, I guess that seaweed wrapped around his head. I mean, that is a sign of desperation and just struggle, isn't it? You know, and pain. And I think we can all identify at that time, the times of being thrown out the boat, seaweed wrapped around their own heads, and not seeing the light, I guess, for that sort of, I guess, strong vision that I'm getting. That in regards to stories I hear and what Jonah's experiences, many of the conversations, I guess, comes from this denial of who I am and being overtaken by the problems in someone's life.
That word overtaking is really significant. Those words there in 2:5, the waters were at my throat. I'm feeling overwhelmed. You know, the engulfing waters threatened me, the deep surrounded me. You kind of hear that, don't you?
You do.
Yeah.
You do. And with that, there's vulnerability in that admittance, you know, that we can't do it alone as much as we would try to. And in my context, coming to consult with me, many people, is that they need some support. Yeah.
So what are some of those, I suppose, some of those deep emotions that maybe we experience, but also the other ones that you would encounter? Like Jonah here, he's run and been kind of caught out, essentially. He knows the character of God and has chosen to disobey. Like, can you speak a little bit to things like guilt and shame and how they become like that seaweed, you know, that feels like it's engulfing me, so to speak?
It's well documented, that, isn't it? I guess with guilt and shame, it's overwhelming, isn't it? We forget who we are and we're overtaken by that guilt-ridden, internalised thought about ourselves, aren't we? And that silences how we see ourselves.
So you say silence is how we see ourselves and that overtakes who we are. Again, we do a little bit of planning for these interviews, but then people just say stuff and then I ask questions. So I'm just going to keep on asking questions. Like, particularly working with people who maybe don't have faith, where does their identity come from in those moments? Like, what is being overtaken? Like, where can they possibly get hope? Not from God.
Well, hopefully through the conversations I have with people, which I'm humbled to be witnessing these stories, and it's like a gift, and that's humbling for me, and I think I need to be humbled in that, and that coming to me, hopefully they see Jesus through me. Maybe it's not named, but perhaps I'd like to think that it's always there, and Jesus is always guiding them through it, and, you know, leaping forward. If the conversations do come up about God, I'll share my faith where it's relevant.
Yeah, it's really great. I think it's interesting in this passage here, you kind of get this ebb and flow, this kind of movement from distress, in my distress I call to the Lord, but also this kind of almost deliverance, this sense of like, God is present and I know who he is, but also I'm suffering right now. Can you speak to that movement, particularly as people are going through grief, trauma, and if they do have a faith lens? Do you witness that kind of movement on a regular basis, that kind of like, I'm in despair, but also I know that there is a God who delivers, and that ebb and flow on such a regular basis?
Absolutely. And what resonates here, Gav, is that there's competing ideas that challenge how we see ourselves.
Talk about those competing ideas.
Every, and I think the digital age, especially in the context of my work, really impacts the way people see themselves in those dominant discourses. Not because they're factually right or wrong, but because they're dominant. They affect how people see themselves. And I'd hope to feel that when people come and connecting with myself, that they feel validated in their own thinking, their internal utterances that they may not have shared with anyone before because of these competing ideas of self based on what they hear around them or see through social media, that they have that validation that it's okay to think in this way. Yeah, and that's God delivering me into that point in conversation, isn't it? And me not feeling as if I've got to compete with other ideas as well.
Yeah, but at the same time, you also, I suppose, have a responsibility to also to be a truth speaker. I know this is an interesting one because you're a counsellor, like, you know, you got professional limitations around practice, and I know we've had a lot of conversations around vulnerability and what that looks like and some new approaches to that. How do you navigate that balance between giving permission for someone to have a safe place to share what it is that they're feeling, and maybe even some of those ideas that have been the dominant voice within their life through social media or through friends and that kind of stuff? To what extent do you give space to that, and then when do you go about challenging that?
I'll connect this, but my assumption is that we all have the capacity to make meaning of our experiences. Yeah, and we're always telling stories and giving somebody that opportunity to tell the stories in a way that highlights the significance of their sharing and based on what they value. Quite often, the conversation will go towards, or gravitate towards them becoming aware that the decisions they're making or the actions they're taking are contradicting what they truly believe in themselves. And isn't that what God wants us to feel, to think, to act upon? Yet, of course, there's duty of care and there's other situations that come up that you do have to be upfront. And like our kids, within my context, having 3 kids, sometimes they may not like it, but you hope the right intention comes across, as in my commitment to their welfare within the context of the counselling, that they will appreciate and understand.
It's interesting, even in this story of Jonah, like when we think about the broad brushstrokes, the way that God is presented through the entire story of Jonah is one of God, a God of mercy and compassion. Like he says, this is going to happen if they don't change. Like there's a natural consequence, but all the way through, there's a sense of, but I don't want that to happen, right? I think it's sometimes fascinating how we see Jonah being thrown over and swallowed by a fish. It's like, is this a consequence or is this a grace? Because this suddenly creates this opportunity for reflection of circumstance, reflection of self. I realize this isn't a question. I'm just talking now.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating that you always see God as this merciful God in and through the scriptures. And so there's a sense in which even those points where God is challenging Jonah through his experience in the belly of the fish, he's still wanting to do a work within him.
Yeah, and I love Ian when last week, he was going as far away from God as he could. He was on the way to Antarctica. God was still there.
Yeah.
Waiting for Jonah.
Yeah.
When Jonah, actively threw himself out of the boat, did he have faith that God was going to save him then? We don't know. Or was that the fact that he was broken and he had to actually let it go? That's the experience I get. People come to consult with me, is that they're relying and trusting on who I am. And that comes with huge responsibility.
Absolutely.
But knowing that God,
God's got to meet them there too.
Exactly. And God's already met me. He's put me in that position. He's scattered me to be working within the context I am.
That's great. I was thinking about our reading today, Genesis 3. We get that image of the point where the people chose to make a decision to do the wrong thing, the thing that you've been commanded not to do, and the first thing that they experienced was shame. And then they made clothes out of fig leaves and they hid. There's something super encouraging about the fact that God would have known this, and yet he still went out to meet them. He still met them in that place. He didn't kind of go, well, I know what's happened here. Now I'm going to, not engage.
Yeah, well, and is this sort of what's absent but implied to no shame? The difference between right and wrong and the decisions you're making. And God trusts that we will get there, or hopefully we'll get there.
Yeah, certainly committed to the journey.
Committed to the journey, absolutely.
Yeah, that's good. So, we've kind of talked a bit here, and you've kind of talked professionally, but I suppose for all of us, how can we be, as people who are scattered into, various vocational spaces, medical, teachers, our homes, families, so many places across Alice Springs, how can we be more tuned in, I suppose, to some of these deep emotions that people are sharing so that we can kind of best serve them?
It's an interesting idea, and a couple of weeks ago, hey Gavin, I responded this week, given my active response to emails. What are the nuances of care? And I feel strongly, and I feel all of us have the ability to care. All of us show care to everyone, to people around us. Sometimes we're on our game. Sometimes, we're off a little bit. I think recognising that we all have that capacity, and that's God-driven, isn't it? And that's what God has in our heart, to care for others. Within the context of work, professional, which is just another layer to who we are in our identity, it's being mindful of the competing priorities.
Yep.
And trying to centre in, actually, hang on a moment, take a breath. Why am I here? God's got me here. This is where I need to slow down the conversation, for instance, and really centre it on that. Knowing professionally we're skilled, we've got the acumen, we've got the abilities to work within the confines of whether it's organisation or teaching music, or we've got that capacity to care. Yeah. God will bring us to that point.
I really want to pick up on a couple of those words that you kind of mentioned there. You kind of said them almost in passing, but they're actually quite profound. This idea that when we're meeting with people in these places, what does it look like to slow down the conversation? Like that's something that actually a lot of us probably could do, is that just have a little bit more pause and a little bit more listening before responding. I know I could do that. I'm not necessarily demonstrating that well right now even, but the sense of... I know it is. That's what makes you such a good counsellor. But there's a sense of being able to slow down, but also the other thing you picked up on there was to discern those competing influences. Sorry, I used a different word there. But this idea of like, what are those forces that are informing this person's state of mind and that are informing the state of trauma? And you need to be able to slow down in order to kind of really witness those things well and to assess the extent to which those voices, whether it be social media or parents or a boss or even the internal voice from past trauma, is informing that current state of being. So yeah, I think they're things that we can possibly do too.
And I think slowing down allows me to be curious in nature. And when we stop being curious, I think that's when we start to assume someone's experience may be similar to mine or similar to someone else's. So I think that's a very important point. And discerning that the individual experiences is there alone, and we all come with different stories. We all come with different experiences of being that Jonah.
Yeah. You know. I mean, I think there's something encouraging about even just the way of Jesus. I love the fact that even there's a number of stories where Jesus is meeting people and they have they have a healing or something that they need, but Jesus still asks them, what is it that you want? Like there's something about kind of slowing it down to be like, rather than me kind of being like, here's the solution, here's the fast answer, Jesus is like, so what is it that you want in this situation?
And that takes heavy work, and I think it'd be easy for me to say, okay, you've come with certain criteria, I mean, I'm in a position where I'm not a doctor, so I haven't got that, those pressures and evidence-based sort of practice yet. I could say, especially with teachers, refer to me, let's fix the problem. Yet, if I wasn't to meet the person where they're at, I wouldn't hear their story. Yeah. And therefore I wouldn't build that trust with me, and therefore that's that trust with God. God will meet us where we're at.
Yeah. That's right.
And I need to do that, I feel, in my job, so I can actually speak into their lives where their story is actually heard. Yeah,
that's great. Well, let's continue through this second part of this prayer. I mean, what I love is the fact that Jonah's literally in a giant fish, so there's not many other competing voices in this situation right now, except for maybe the internal ones. Let's keep going here. The second part of verse 6. But you, Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit. Again, look at that deliverance kicking back in. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. I will say, salvation comes from the Lord. Oh, there's so much stuff I want to pick up on there. Those who cling to worthless idols, like, what do we make idols in our life that actually catches our attention, becomes the dominant voice rather than God's love for us? Oh, that's rich.
It is rich. And talk about dominant discourses often, which I have today, because that is that competing voice, those competing idols, that competition with self, of not being who I am because I want to fit in. I want to be of the world without listening to me, not me myself, but hopefully I can, that voice of reasoning, of listening to who they are.
So true. So, I mean, we hear this kind of turn in Jonah's second half of this prayer where you kind of hear this hope emerge. God brought my life up from the pit. My life was ebbing away. I remembered you. There's this kind of like turning point. Tell me a little bit about where hope, that is trusting in a better future or a greater power, how does hope play a role in the journey through or toward healing and breakthrough?
Well, before I go into sort of and I guess I'm centered in how I philosophically, I think it's a philosophical stance that you carry in my position. Yeah,
your mic a little bit just so we can hear.
But, yeah.
Down a bit further.
Cheers.
That's it.
Thanks. Yet there's evidence quite strongly suggesting that in my profession as a counsellor, if we have hope, that counts for like 30%, a fair percentage of the work that you're doing as practitioners. So, and that's profound, isn't it? So if we don't have hope, we aren't working in with the guys that we feel there's a deliverance within the person that's possible. It shuts down, a fair percentage of how we work towards that. That makes sense.
That's pretty profound, because like that sense of going, like, we would assume that, like, a counsel would hopefully have hope in their client, right? We would hope that.
You would.
But at the same time, when we think about our areas of influence and the relationships that we might engage with while people are going through things, just to consider the fact it's like, if we don't have hope for them, are they going to miss out on potentially, we'll say 30% or of this possibility?
Yeah, absolutely.
Are we actually going to hinder the ability for them to find that preferred future, that healing?
And if we believe truly within ourselves that there's these counter stories to the problems that people coming to me, that they're experiencing, they'll pick up on that. The people will pick up on that. And it's the same with the conversations we have with anyone, really, isn't it? Yeah. That we truly believe that there is an alternate story to what they're experiencing.
There is an alternate story. See, that's, for me, I love that line, because there's this sense in which it's like when we meet people, and sometimes people will just disclose things and we don't expect it. We'll be sitting in the staff room with somebody and someone will suddenly be like, hey, this is happening, or, you might notice someone is tired and you're like, hey, you look a bit tired, or if you've got a relationship with them, you can say that. How are the energy levels going? And then suddenly they'll disclose something, and in that moment you're like, what am I doing? What do I do here? Just that kind of posture that I think is informed by our faith in Jesus, that there is a better story for this person, that there is hope, that there is a pathway that God has for them. Like, that's pretty significant to make the choice to be part of what God is doing in their life in that moment.
Absolutely, and that can come out in different ways, can't it?
So what are some of the ways that I suppose you see that expressed?
Expressed by the people.
By the people who are caring. The way that you kind of, I suppose, express that hope. How do you speak to that hope?
I mean, this is sort of not a dominant sort of idea, but what's absent but implied in someone's experiences, as in to know sadness implying that you know happiness. Otherwise, how would you be able to discern the difference?
Sure. So what is like if they experience sadness, providing the fact that if you only know sadness because you know an alternative.
Absolutely.
And so then elevating and highlighting that.
Based on what the person's experiences. So there's always, you loiter around the problems in someone's life as Jesus, God does with us. He's patient with us.
Yes.
There's always these alternate stories that will emerge.
So, for example, if someone's experiencing shame, it's like not the reason, that's very definitive, but we understand that the reason they're experiencing shame is because there is some sort of value, potentially, depending upon what that's based upon, that is suggesting that they didn't hit that mark.
Absolutely.
And so therefore, how do we elevate and affirm the fact that they have this value, if indeed it is good and true, that is hopefully, for the most part, something they can inform their life around, if it is healthy. Which
goes back to assuming that person has the capacity to make meaning of what they're experiencing, and there's counter stories already in their lives, and there's a history of that, and thickening up the richness of those experiences and what that means about their intentions for life and their commitment to life.
Yeah,
where that becomes dominant.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, and even here in the Jonah passage, like we've got this ebb and flow, this up and down, but I love that last declaration. What I have vowed, I will make good. So that vow kind of, there is this echo of like history there. It's like I've vowed something, I've declared something, right, in my past, and no matter what I've experienced up to this point, no matter the decisions that I've made up to this point, I will say salvation comes from the Lord. Like I will declare this again. So even though my current narrative around my situation, my circumstances seems in stark contrast to that original vow, I'm going to redeclare that vow. It's lovely to see that kind of emerge from within him.
Absolutely. And, I'll share just a quick story, and obviously no detail at all, given it's not my experience to share and it's within the context of counselling. But interesting when you approached me, invited me to consider Jonah and speaking about that in context of my work. I had a student come in distressed, came out being Christian, and they brought the passage of Jonah into the conversation. And we didn't get down to the context of, or to the detail of what that was about, but isn't that wonderful that we're aware, we're mindful of how God's working. God was working in their life, and it just so happened to be on my heart that I was trying to understand Jonah as well. So together, we're able to actually unpack that.
Yeah. And there is that sense of togetherness. And I know, again, you could speak for a long time on this, but we'll just kind of slowly work our way toward wrapping up. But this idea of, again, God meeting people where they're at, but also you adopting that posture as a counsellor. Again, this wasn't really on our radar, but at the same time, I do want to talk about it because I think the approach is something that's quite revolutionary and Christ-like in its approach. For God to meet people in that moment and to have that understanding, but also for you as a counsellor to also extend a level of vulnerability as they are extending a level of vulnerability, as opposed to a more clinical approach where you remain over here at a distance and the person kind of enters that space. Can you speak to that briefly? Because I think that speaks not only professionally but also to the everyday encounters that we have with people.
Yeah, like that everyday counsellor that we have in people. We all have the capacity to listen, to discern, to provide feedback and suggestions. Hey, of course, within what my work is, I've come with that particular training on how to approach those conversations, but I think we all have that capacity.
Mutual vulnerability.
That mutual vulnerability, it's important. I think what I've learned over the years is not any of us are immune to emotion. And even though we may come into certain circumstances or situation where we've got the professional gaze within counselling, I'm going to be affected by those conversations. And I guess just to let people know, there's structured ways to go about that so you don't overshare and it becomes about myself, because that's just not,
Not helpful.
Not helpful at all to anyone, and it's bad practice. But I think if we can be vulnerable in how we're affected by the conversations from people who come and see me, that can be so profound, because they got feedback on how me as a person has been influenced and what I'll take away from those conversations.
And there's a sense in which it's like, it also just affirms that what they shared, you become a safe person, you become an ally in that place as well, of kind of going, that does affect, it validates the feeling. We can talk about the motivation for that feeling and contest that potentially, but it validates the feeling and the experience of what it means to be human and live within a broken world or inside the belly of a fish, as the case may be.
Absolutely. In that way, that is an African proverb of I am because who you are. And if we can actually embody that, that's quite significant, especially if there's other ideas that are competing with how somebody sees themselves and you're challenging that.
It's great.
Yeah.
Well, we're probably going to wrap up. I just want to finish this chapter with the last verse. Following this prayer, and the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. That's where we're going to pick up the story next week as Si speaks on it. But I just want to reflect, I suppose, what I've heard from you today, and particularly reflecting on Jonah chapter 2 and this prayer in the belly of a fish. I hear this permission to slow down, whether it is when dealing with our own deep emotions, shame, guilt, pain, anger, these things that maybe Jonah was feeling, but also that a role that we have to maybe slow down the conversation when we encounter others who are going through those deep emotions too. I hear this impetus, this instruction to look for those competing voices. Like, which are the dominant voices that are informing these deep emotions? And being real about those. And I also hear the character of God meeting people in the midst of those vulnerable spaces, and also the role that we play meeting people in those vulnerable places with our own level of vulnerability too.
I think just in closing almost that, every conversation I have is a gift, and to honour that, to acknowledge that, to treat it as a gift, I think is very important. And that's where you can center yourself in the appreciation of what's been shared. Yeah, and be curious about that.
Yeah. And again, going back to our Genesis 3 passage, which I don't think we actually read it, but when God's response, "Who told you that you were naked?" he was at least willing to engage in that situation, that reality that they were experiencing right there from the beginnings of guilt and shame. And it's the God who continues to engage with us in these places. It's just grateful that we can be a part of that too.
Absolutely. And he clothed them.
And he clothed them. That's right.
That he knew. So
it's exactly what he did. He clothed them. That was the next line. Brilliant. Can we thank Tim for sharing today? I'd like to just, in closing, just to pray. I'd like to pray for Tim, but also pray for all of us as we meet people in the midst of their vulnerabilities, that God would use us in those places. Would you please join me? God, we read through a prayer like Jonah's, and maybe it even stirs up emotions within us. We might resonate with his story and feeling the seaweed around our throat. We may feel trapped or being buffeted by the waves. Maybe, God, in those places, we ourselves are working through that pattern of despair and deliverance, the ups and downs. God, thank you that you meet us in those places. That you can remind us of what is true, that you can quiet those dominant voices that might seek to undermine what is true about us and about the extent and the wealth of your love toward us. Jesus, we also want to pray, God, as people who will be scattered and are scattered all across Alice, this nation, and across the world. Help us to meet people in these deep moments of emotion too. Help us to slow down the conversation and give permission for vulnerability. Help us to affirm what is true in people and be agents of hope. Not flippant hope, but hope that sits with people and affirms that there is a better story for them. Help us not to rush, but to trust in your timing, because you are good and you are faithful. And as Jonah declares, salvation comes from the Lord. And so we hand this over to you, knowing that, God, you're going to present us with opportunities this week to meet people in these places. May we be faithful. In your name, amen.